Perhaps the biggest misconception or outright fabrication in the American vernacular is the use of the terms Hispanic and Latino as ethnic or racial identifiers. One of my earliest videos was over the race of Mexicans, or more specifically how Mexican is not a race and desperately needs to stop being used as an adjective in American vocabulary to describe such, as just like Brazilians, Argentines, Cubans, or even Americans, Mexicans are not an ethnic, racial, or cultural monolith, and it really makes no sense whenever one implies that, as the differences in physical appearance among Mexicans and other Latinos is vast to say the least. This is going to be an opinionated video similar to my video over continents and why they make no sense as well, which much to my surprise you guys really seem to find interesting. So here's my quandaries over the terms Hispanic, Latino, or Mexican to describe one's race or ethnicity. There are some obvious inconsistencies that will point out how insanely ridiculous the whole notion of Latino in the American sense really is. So, generally speaking, Latin America is a term used to describe the areas of the American continents that have a heritage and culture predominantly derived from the Romance, also known as Latin or Italic countries of Europe, with the main ones being Portugal, Spain, France, and Italy, and Romania. And while the term Hispanic is used to denote someone specifically of full or partial Spanish heritage. So, is Haiti considered a part of Latin America? Usually not, due to the fact that their ancestry and culture is far more African-derived than Latin, yet they speak French and the French-based Haitian Creole. However, the province of Quebec in Canada, of which the majority of inhabitants are monolingual French speakers, is almost never considered a part of Latin America, despite the majority of the Quebecois population having French, Italian, Portuguese, or other Latin ancestry. You might think that it's because Quebec is a part of Canada, which is a majority Anglo-Germanic country. However, Puerto Rico, which has been a territory of the United States since the 1800s, is considered a part of Latin America. So basically, there are no rules. Also, when Texas or California becomes a majority Hispanic state, will it de facto become a part of Latin America? Will all Texans, regardless of ethnic background, automatically be labeled Latino just because the majority of the population is of Latin descent? Or will it take a generation or two? Would Latinos even be considered Latino if they and their descendants only spoke English? On the United States Census, which is a whole other can of worms to get into, they allow for a few questions denoting ancestry of individuals, with the racial categories already having massive flaws, which I've discussed before with the labels of white, black, Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander, multiracial, and any other race, while they also ask for a more specific ethnic origin based solely off the current national borders such as Italian, South Sudanese, Cambodian, etc., which is odd, and the most perplexing question is that over Hispanic and Latino origin, with a simple yes or no answer, sometimes with more options denoting which region of Latin America the individual has ancestry from, which to me just seems, bizarrely specific, although I realize, yes, it is a way for the US government to keep track of how many people are coming through the southern border, but from a demographic standpoint, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to specifically single out this group, and this has had massive repercussions on the vernacular used by people in America and the entire world. The Hispanic and Latino identifier effectively overrides the previous questions based on race and national origin, and this creates real conundrums when you consider those with origins directly from Spain, who would be considered Hispanic and therefore non-white. However, the neighboring Portuguese, Moroccans, Turks, and even Afghanis are considered white on the US Census. However, the term Latino is used only to refer to those with origins from Brazil or the Spanish-speaking countries of the Americas, and hence does not include Spain or Portugal. But how far back does this go? Is a Brazilian citizen whose parents were born in Italy considered Latino? What about someone of pure German descent whose family has been located in Argentina for generations and only speaks Spanish? In Latin America, racial identification is far more fluid and based mostly on phenotype, which is why the Jews, Romani, or even those of Middle Eastern or North African descent were simply absorbed into the Castilian majority in most cases and have greatly contributed to the Latino identity. Some Spanish-speaking African descendants in Colombia or elsewhere are also sometimes considered Hispanic, and even some Native Americans who have lost their original language and have taken up Spanish and assimilated into mainstream society are considered Hispanic. So, the vast majority of inhabitants in Latin America and their descendants in the United States do indeed have some level of racial miscegenation, but by no means are they even close to a homogeneous gene pool. A bigger question in the US is whether someone of quote-unquote half Hispanic, half white ancestry would be considered Hispanic or not. Certainly not an insignificant question, considering that those of partial Anglo and Hispanic ancestry are actually currently the fastest growing group in the United States by far. What if only one grandparent was Latino? Are they automatically considered Latino then? What if they had a paternal ancestor from hundreds of years ago that had passed on a Spanish surname, but nobody else in their entire family tree was Latino? Why aren't French or Italian or even Belgian Americans considered Latino when Italians are essentially the quintessential Latin descendants and Sardinians speak a dialect more closely related to Latin than any other living tongue? So really what we're referring to is Iberian America, because in the common American English vernacular, when using the term Latin America or Latino, it's pretty much just whatever it needs to be at the moment, but mostly in reference to the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries, both a part of the Iberian grouping of the Italic languages. And really, this term is used for a cultural rather than ethnic or racial identifier. Now, you could make the argument that over many hundreds of years of intermarriage and mixing, these nationalities effectively act as ethnic groups, but there still isn't a single country in Latin America with an ethnic and cultural homogeneity, as in nearly every Latino country there are specific groups that have emerged distinct from one another, mostly based off of the archaic casta system from Spanish rule. The main mixed ethnicities in Latin America are the mestizos, mixed Amerindian and European, mulattoes, mixed African and European, Sambos, mixed African and Amerindian, and Pardos, who are a mix of all three, although they aren't strictly dichotomous in admixture, as for instance mestizos may be only 30% European in Bolivia, or maybe even 70% in some countries, and even have a small degree of African admixture as well, while the Pardos of Brazil are actually majority European on average, but this does vary highly by region, with the southern states having the highest degree of European ancestry, the northeast having the highest African component, and the northwest having the highest Amerindian component. So for the purposes of this video, and so you get a better understanding of how I view the world and portray it on my channel, I generally use the term Latin America to denote any and all countries or territories located south of the US border, as there is no other standard definition or one that makes sense from a historic or demographic standpoint. And although Anglo-Caribbean countries like Jamaica or the Bahamas don't speak Latin languages, nor are they descended from them, there is a bit of a regional culture that transcends ethnic and racial boundaries, as I discussed in my Redrawing the Continents video. However, when using the term Latino in a racial sense, I am referring to the multiracial groups mentioned earlier, as it doesn't make sense to group together whites, blacks, and Native Americans just because they speak the same language. And this is really just for purposes of convenience, as even though it doesn't entirely make sense to group together all the previous groups, it's at least somewhat consistent. I created this genomic expression of Latino countries that are aggregates of dozens of studies, with estimates varying wildly by source, but there are a few main outliers among this grouping of Latino territories, that being Haiti, which is overwhelmingly African, Bolivia, which is mostly Native American, and Quebec, the most European territory. However, even though the average genetic components of these remainder countries are comparable, there are still large differences between different self-identified groupings in them. For instance, in Brazil, the three main racial groups, Branco, Pardo, and Preto, are on average around 80, 60, and 40% European, 10, 30, and 50% African, obviously with large overlap and disparities between individuals, but we're discussing averages here. Similarly, in Hispanic countries, self-identified whites still do have some degree of non-European heritage, at least far more than whites in Anglo countries, yet are still genetically closer to Europeans than mestizos or mulattoes, so it would seem disingenuous to imply the American one-drop rule in this situation. You'll find that from Ecuador to Brazil, the gene pool is similar, all countries within 20% of each other in terms of the European component. However, the distribution is still highly irregular among different groups, and the remainder of the genome is still variable. For instance, Panama and Belize have very similar genetic compositions, both split fairly evenly between European, African, and Native American components. However, in Panama, the African component is more dispersed into the mestizo and mulatto populations, and hence there are fewer individuals of predominantly African ancestry, while in Belize, the African component is more centralized, with about a fourth of the population being predominantly African, leading to two countries with very similar genetic makeups, yet highly divergent demographics. If people are capable of recognizing the United States and Canada for the complex ethnic, linguistic, racial, and religious melting pots that they are, it only seems fair to also recognize the Latino countries of the Americas as the hodgepodge that they are as well, instead of treating them as a monolithic group from the standpoint of culture, physical appearance, and ancestry, as the American media and Hollywood all too often do. Hispanic and Latino are two terms which, from a demographic standpoint, at least in terms of ethnic or racial categorization, need to be denormalized or at least rebranded. If there's anything I've learned through studying the world through a demographic and historic lens, is that sometimes things are rather simple to define and other times not so much. But in my own words, that doesn't mean we shouldn't take the time to learn about them and discover the truth for ourselves. Of course, my views are constantly evolving, so go ahead and let me know your thoughts on Latin America and its relation to the other regions of the Americas and its constituent source population derived from natives of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And for today's poll, let me know which Latin-descended population of the Americas you would like to learn more about. As always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.